one is the same person, whether in New Zealand or in the UK. People in the 1970s and 80s would be more aware of you if you were in Europe than if you were in Australasia. So there were wonderful opportunities to attend international conferences, and I became very involved in the International Physiotherapy Group for Cystic Fibrosis, finishing up as its chair for, or president as New Zealand would say, as its chair for a couple of years. That was a very interesting and rewarding experience, and many friendships were formed as we worked our way through problems within airway clearance. By this stage, this would be the 1980s, different airway clearance regimens had emerged. Autogenic drainage, which is associated with the Belgian Jean Chevalier, was conceived by Jean in the early to late 1960s, but was not presented internationally until we presented our work in the late 1970s. Following that, the Danes presented their work on the positive expiratory pressure mask, or PEP mask, and that led on to oscillating PEP. And in that context we have the flutter from Switzerland and widely used in the United States, and the cornet from Germany. Simultaneously, the Americans, with their love for gadgets and expertise in that field, were working on high-frequency chest wall oscillation. And for them, the jacket, as it was initially known as, was revolutionary because, as we had found in England, it gave the patient independence. It was promoted in the United States by the insurance companies because the insurance companies were having to fund physiotherapists to visit people with cystic fibrosis in their homes to do assisted postural drainage. With the advent of the vest, the insurance companies could buy a vest and the patient could do his own physiotherapy. And that was more economical than continuing for the life of the patient with assisted physiotherapy. Initially, those of us who were the proponents of the regimen, and I had become the face for the Thompsons at that point in time in Europe, we sat very much, or stood very much, on our own pedestals. And although we listened to the others, we were not convinced that what they were doing was better than what we were doing. But gradually the barriers broke down, and there were many similarities, and are many similarities, among the regimens. Looking back, it is the forced expiration technique, the huffing and breathing control, that has crept in to most of the regimens. In the surgical patient, it's widely used together with ambulation. In PEP, it's used to clear secretions when they have been loosened and mobilized and brought to the upper airways. Even Jean Chevalier, in his autogenic drainage, will slip in the occasional huff. And it is a part of high-frequency chest wall oscillation and oscillating PEP. Jean is a very charismatic character and a brilliant clinician. I found it very difficult to pick up the autogenic drainage technique. I know all about it in theory, but I think Jean summed it up after one conference dinner when he put an arm around me and said, "Jennifer, if you come to visit me for a couple of days, we would just tweak the active cycle of breathing techniques, and we would then have autogenic drainage. There are considerable similarities between the two, in that I think, or I would describe, an autogenic drainage breath as a very gentle huff. I realise I've just slipped in the words active cycle of breathing techniques. This came into being when, after the Reisman paper, when we realised that it was not sufficient to just call huffing and breathing control the forced expiration technique, that huffing was continuing to be taken out of context. By then calling the whole regimen the active cycle of breathing techniques, people, we hoped, would be more aware that it was positioning, if indicated, breathing control, thoracic expansion exercises, with or without chest clapping, breathing control, huffing, and breathing control. This happened before electronic literature searches, and we hadn't, these weren't, the electronic literature search wasn't even on the horizon. And we had no appreciation of the problems that that would cause until at a conference a few years later, an abstract was presented on the active cycle of breathing techniques, and it was the active cycle of breathing techniques compared with conventional postural drainage in people with cystic fibrosis. It was a duplication of our 1978-79 study. The team from the north of England had done a literature search, an electronic one, and concluded that no work had been done comparing conventional postural drainage with the active cycle of breathing techniques. They understandably hadn't realised that the active cycle of breathing techniques was what we had originally called postural drainage using the forced expiration technique. So the airway clearance literature, sadly, has become confusing and conflicting. But with a few of the facts highlighted, one can see one's way through the mire. And there are components of each of them that may well suit an individual patient. But my feeling is, and that of a number of us, that an individual regimen can and should be adapted to the individual patient, the patient in front of you. Some people, for example, will need a very gentle huff to produce the best results, one bordering on an autogenic drainage breath. Others will want to use a slightly more forceful one. But each individual regimen can be adapted to suit the individual, young or old, sick or fit. The other school of thought is that we should be looking for objective indicators as to when to recommend one regimen and when to recommend another. Further implications of these two schools of thought are for those in developing countries where there is no money to purchase equipment. And for a while it was sad to see people being invited to, through the international cystic fibrosis groups, speak in developing countries and taking with them the gadgets of the flutter and PET mask. And from Brazil, a visiting physiotherapist a year or two later explained how they had had a team who taught them the different physiotherapy regimens and had left them with a PET mask. This PET mask, the rubber surrounding the mask itself, was in tatters 4 years later because it was the only mask they had. And although they'd looked after it very carefully between patients, it had to be cleaned and, understandably, deteriorated over the years. What they should have been taught was a regimen independent of a device, either the active cycle of breathing techniques or autogenic drainage. And from research work which we were involved with, all those regimens are equally as effective and therefore can be taken to developing countries without the cost implications of equipment. What also came across in working with people from different countries were two things. One, a very humbling experience in that I speak English only. Most of them are multilingual. And I would go up to a group at a meeting and they would have been talking in French or German or Spanish, would immediately stop and switch to English for my benefit, which I was appreciative of, but it was a little embarrassing to realise how better educated in the languages they were than I was. The other point was that on many of the times when we felt we had conflicting and completely conflicting ideas and thoughts, it was a misunderstanding of the English language rather than a disagreement amongst us. And it became much easier to manage conversations and to move things forward when once I understood that this was more often than not the problem. And we were then, rather than competing against ourselves, able to move forward as a group to the benefit of the patient.